Hello, everybody. So for this video, we are going to look at the causes of World War II and kind of look at a couple of different factors of this. Specifically in this particular video, I want to focus on the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and kind of the international situation that occurs during the 1930s specifically that ultimately facilitates both his rise to power within Germany itself, but also look at the international dynamics that lead to, well, eventually World War II. His kind of unchecked rise to power and dominance in Europe. And so the best place to start is really kind of with World War II is to look at the end of the last war, World War One. As I've discussed in previous videos, at the end of World War One, there is an international peace conference held in Paris at the Treaty of at the Palace of Versailles, and here a treaty is eventually signed, the Treaty of Versailles, hence the name, and that treaty does a couple of things that ultimately effectively doom the kind of infantile, fledgling democracy that had formed in Germany after the abdication of the Kaiser in late 1918, the Weimar Republic, as it's oftentimes known. And there are a couple of important parts of this. The first is that the Treaty of Versailles assigns complete blame on Germany for the First World War, and as a consequence of that, it requires Germany to not only disarm itself, but also to pay a massive reparations to the Allies as a punishment for having allegedly caused the First World War, which again, is far from a accurate assessment of World War One in terms of who actually caused it. There's multiple people at blame for World War One. Germany is certainly one of them, but not the only one. But anyway, so what this does is pretty much plunges Germany into complete chaos. Throughout the 1920s, there's hyperinflation within Germany. Really, their depression begins long before the depression hits the rest of the world in October of 1929. And of course, that only makes things worse when that it does eventually hit. There's hyperinflation. There's also a lot of resentment and bitterness. And this results in street battles within Germany between two groups: the communists, who blame the ruling elite, the military, and Germany's industrial, bankers, financial elite, what have you, for the war, and a growing right wing paramilitary series of groups who eventually consolidate under the auspices of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or as they call themselves, the Nazis. And so basically, throughout the 1920s, there are, in some cases, pitched street battles between the Nazis and communists um, over fighting for control. Um, Battles which the prevailing authorities, the more moderate and liberal parties in the Weimar Republic, find very difficult to quell. Basically, as opposed to the communists, who, like I said, blamed Germany's post World War One woes on the decisions made by military and economic and industrial leaders. The Nazis decided to focus their blame on a very different group of people. Basically, the Nazis made two principal and completely unsubstantiated charges um, about who was to blame for Germany's humiliation in the First World War. The first was that Germany had been defeated by people who had been insufficiently patriotic. That this whole idea of Germany being stabbed in the back. This is sometimes referred to as the stabbed in the back narrative. And a big part of this was also related to the second point, which was blaming Germany's woes on its Jewish population. Um, Germany has a long history of anti Semitism, going back many centuries to the Middle Ages. And there are many notable instances of anti Semitism, even Martin Luther, who started the Protestant Reformation, wrote some pretty well-known anti-Semitic tracts. So there's this long history of anti-Semitism within Germany, but it had remained relatively dormant. Prior to World War I, many German Jews had become leading figures in German society. Germany's renowned university system was in many areas largely staffed by Jewish academics. And Jews certainly played a prominent role, much greater relative to their actual numbers in Germany's artistic and cultural scenes, and in Germany's uh, economy. And so basically, the Nazis blamed Germany's woes on Jews. Um, this, of course, like I said, is completely bogus. Many German Jews served in World War I, including, ironically enough, the officer who recommended Adolf Hitler for the Iron Cross on the Western Front during World War I, which he then subsequently used during the 1930s to build his political career and sell himself as a genuine war hero to the German people. History is filled with all kinds of ironies like that, but that I think is probably one of the deepest and darkest for sure. But anyway, so Hitler taps into this latent anti Semitism that's pretty much always been there, right beneath the surface within Germany. He puts forward this idea that there's this vast Jewish conspiracy to control finance and culture and everything, and blames Jews and other groups within Germany for Germany's humiliation in the First World War, for being insufficiently patriotic, for being insufficiently supportive of the war effort. And so, capitalizing on the social and economic unrest within Germany, the Nazis slowly but surely build a political following. Initially, their appeals are relatively limited given their fierce anti Semitism, which doesn't really appeal to as many people as is commonly assumed. Um, but eventually, the Nazis add to their anti Semitism this sort of broad economic appeal, promising, um, they call it bread and labor, bread and work, a return to economic prosperity, while also tapping into the anti Semitism. So there's this combination of stoking and activating long dormant prejudices, playing into economic anxiety, and kind of tapping into this general sense of disillusionment that plays very well for them. Uh, and so, as a result of this, the Nazis grow in power within Germany as a political entity, um, culminating in 1932 with the Nazis winning the largest share of the votes in the German parliament. Now, it is important to stress, and I really can't stress this enough, the Nazis never enjoyed anything resembling to a majority of support within Germany before Adolf Hitler assumed complete dictatorial control in 1934. They were, they never enjoyed the support of more than 1/3 of the population. Ultimately, the reason why the Nazis were able to seize power in Germany was due to both the effectiveness of their messaging, which they were able to, with laser-like precision, focus in on certain groups of people and get them to vote for them. The threat of violence that oftentimes accompanied them, because the Nazis employed armed paramilitaries like the Sturmabteilung, or SA, who would routinely attack their opponents in the streets. Basically, armed thugs. And the other thing was that their political adversaries were too divided to unite with one another. The communists refused to work with more moderate political parties within Germany. And so there was never anybody who was able to form a united front, a united opposition to the Nazis. within Germany. And so that combination of finding and creating a very focused and very solid voting bloc, and the inability of other political parties to form any kind of coherent opposition to the Nazis ultimately facilitated their rise to power. And so ultimately in 1933, in January of 1933, just a few weeks before Franklin Roosevelt is inaugurated as President of the United States, and ultimately takes a decidedly different tact in trying to deal with the Great Depression and the uncertainty and the woes that that creates for the people of the United States, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, second only in authority to the president, President Hindenburg, and President Paul Hindenburg. And once Hitler is named Chancellor, he increasingly assumes dictatorial control within Germany. This isn't formalized until after the death of Paul Hindenburg in 1934, when Hitler declares himself Fuhrer, or leader for life, and becomes a full-fledged dictator. But he does slowly but surely begin, or actually not really that slowly. This all occurs in the space of about a year, so that may be a bit of a misnomer. But between his election of Chancellor in January of 1933 and when Hitler assumes complete dictatorial power in the summer of 1934, I believe August 1934, Hitler outlaws other political parties within Germany other than the Nazi Party. He transforms the press, which prior to his being made Chancellor, he routinely attacked as the, quote, Lügenpresse, or lying press. And he eventually transforms Germany's free press into an effectively a propaganda arm for the Nazi Party under propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. And he also outlaws, in addition to outlawing other political parties, he outlaws trade unions. And he also begins sending political opponents of the Reich, of the German regime, which Hitler begins referring to as the Third Reich. He begins sending those political enemies to concentration camps, where they are kept along with others classified as deviants within German society, a group which included homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, gypsies, and as well as people with physical and mental disabilities. So this is really when things kind of start going sideways, is 1934. After Hitler assumes complete dictatorial power in Germany in 1934, he then decides to focus his attention on Germany's Jewish population. And he does this by passing, there's a series of laws that are passed in Germany in 1935, the year after Hitler becomes dictator. And these are known as the Nuremberg Laws, or Nuremberg Decrees. You'll sometimes see them referred to by both names. And basically what the Nuremberg Laws or decrees do is they do a couple of things. The first thing they do is they strip all Jewish Germans of their citizenship. Even Jewish Germans who had served in and been decorated in the First World War, like Hitler's former commanding officer, are stripped of their citizenship as a result of the Nuremberg decrees. Furthermore, because the Nazis claimed that Germany's defeat in the First World War had been partly the cause of the dilution of the Aryan master race by intermarriage with other non-Aryan mongrel races, to use their own terminology, the Nazis, furthermore, in addition to stripping Jewish Germans of their citizenship, they also forbid intermarriage between Jewish and non-Jewish Germans, and they also require Jewish-owned businesses to have signs in their doors to identify themselves as such, basically to discourage people from shopping there. And they also required Jewish Germans to wear identifying gold armbands. This is the origin of the famous yellow Star of David that Jewish people were forced to wear during the Holocaust. And so, with the passage of the Nuremberg decrees or laws in 1935, Jewish Germans are effectively stripped of their citizenship, are essentially treated from that point onward as second class or worse citizens. And you have this kind of mythology becoming a central narrative in the Nazi Reich. The Nazis basically believed in this sort of mythological version of German history. They believed that Germany in the past had been dominant in different periods of time. That's why they referred to their new German ethno-state as the Third Reich, because this was the third try, basically. And their idea was that at these various other epochs in history, such as at the period of the fall of the Roman Empire, that the Aryan master race had achieved dominance throughout Europe. And that ultimately the inability of Germany to do so was because of the dilution of the bloodline by the intermarriage between Aryans and non-Aryan peoples. And so that sort of focus on racial purity really becomes a primary focus for the Nazis going forward, an obsession really for them, an obsession that would eventually turn them into a completely genocidal regime engaging in the most infamous example of mass murder in human history. So how does that relate to the rest of the world? Well, in addition to Hitler assuming dictatorial control and outlawing free press, outlawing political parties, outlawing trade unions, transforming German Jews into not even second-class citizens, stripping them of their citizenship, and putting them in this decidedly vulnerable position. The Nazis also really wanted to seek vengeance for what Hitler and the Nazis saw as Germany's humiliation in the First World War. And so to that end, starting in 1934, Hitler and the Nazis began a massive rearmament campaign. Now, this is in direct defiance of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had forbidden Germany from having a large army or navy, and had completely forbidden it from having an air force at all. And so the Nazis begin this massive rearmament campaign in 1934. And they largely get away with doing it. And a big part of the reason why Hitler feels confident doing all this stuff is because he looks around at the international community and he sees the way that the international community is reacting to crises all around the globe. And he sees an international community that, by and large, is failing to react properly to those crises, and ultimately that emboldens him. And so that's going to be the focus of the next video. How international crises in other parts of the world ultimately embolden Hitler and ultimately lead to the start of World War II. So that's where we're going to pick up with in the next video.